Hey, hey, hey. It's Filter Free Friday, y'all. Listen, I am so glad y'all here. Let me just say that I'm feeling some kind of way because yesterday, why I tear up in front of like 100 plus of my closest client friends when I was sharing some information about the first chapter of Spark the Heart. And I will tell you that that is one of the downsides of like actually practicing empathy on a greater level. Like you can't be more effectively empathetic without tapping into your own emotions. And I have always, good morning, Miss Van Can. Um, I've always just been very proud of my ability to kind of, no matter what I got going on, to be able to compartmentalize whatever that is and just go right on. But whenever you suppress emotions, they come out, and sometimes at times it might be inappropriate or difficult to deal with. But yeah, today is the 11th day of the Empathy 14, and I'm doing the 14 days again. You can do them anytime you want, but every August, this is the inaugural year, I'm going to kind of push a campaign for us to do the empathy exercises together. And the concept today is grace, and I have been struggling a bit because empathy as a concept, people don't really understand what it means. And I don't say that to be disrespectful, but people think empathy means being nice. Uh, People think empathy means being kind. They think that being empathetic means that you agree with someone. They think that it means you condone behavior. They think empathy is the enemy of productivity. Empathy just has um, just a lot of things associated with it, just that just simply are not accurate. And I was thinking about what I was going to talk about today, and I remembered Jim Baker. I don't know if any of you remember him. He was a televangelist, and when I was about 10, he had gotten in trouble for several different reasons. He was accused of like drugging and raping a woman, and tried to pay her. And when I was like 10, it was something like $250,000 or more that he had paid this, or allegedly paid this woman, to get her to keep quiet about um, drugging and raping her. He was keeping two sets of books for this mega religious institution that he had um, built with his wife, Tammy Faye Baker. He had some other kind of like many of the people who were sending money in were people who were low income, and Jim Baker was like living a life of extravagance and had taken the money and was using it for all kinds of things. And I think because of his issue with the IRS of over like $1.3 million worth of fraud, he went to jail. Okay. And I remember at the time, my young brain didn't understand that. I was like, dang, it really sucks for people make mistakes, right? And when people make mistakes, we're supposed to forgive them and grant them grace. And today, what I know is, at the individual level, listen, I absolutely think that people should be able to make mistakes without punishment, and there are consequences for people's actions. At the beginning of this book, I tell the story about how when my mother was killed by a drunken driver, Mr. Ross had, I don't know how many times he had been in jail for some kind of issue associated with doing drugs or drinking or whatever. Um, he had had his license taken multiple times. That day, he had stolen a car. He had ran a red light. He hit my mother. He ran from the scene of the crime. He had like 8 charges. And I remember not sitting in a spirit of hatefulness, but like, while God forgives you, there are consequences to things. It's like if I sit around and I know that I have kidney disease running in my family, and I eat whatever I want and I don't take good care of my kidneys, God will forgive me all day long, but my body is not going to. And that does not mean that grace is not sufficient for everyone, right? Like, that's not what that means. And so what I remember was that Jim Bakker was defrocked. The entire like evangelical community, the like spoke out against him. And then contrast that with what we're experiencing with especially white evangelicals today. When Donald Trump had lost his case about specifically raping a woman and had to pay her $5 million, like he's not getting the same kind of treatment that Jim Bakker got 30 years ago, right? Like it's just not happening. When you consider the fact that his son-in-law got $2 billion from the Iranians as soon as he got out of office, and the white evangelicals are not speaking out against that, it seems a little bit just hypocritical at best, and empathy cannot sit on a bed of hypocrisy. And when you think about that, Kai Cenat just a few weeks ago was trying to give away a PlayStation, and there ended up being just a lot of children in New York City just going ballistic. And Kai was arrested that day and then charged with, I guess, being responsible for the disorderly conduct that happened. And then you contrast that with what happened on January 6th of 2020. And, that day, I remember that day, that it didn't matter what news outlet you were talking about. People were absolutely, I wish we could go back and watch the video. It didn't matter if it was a conservative outlet. It didn't matter if it was a conservative speaker. It did not matter if it was a conservative representative. It didn't matter. Everyone spoke out against it because they knew that it was wrong. But then after about 3 days later, they're like, this is a witch hunt. This is not fair. We should be focused on something else. And I think about empathy in kind of 3 different buckets. Like, first of all, empathy is directed to people, not to systems and policies and practice. Empathy is directed towards people, not so much to groups. And so when I consider that, let's say you are an individual person who has your own thoughts and opinions about things, you're making mistakes, I'm here to grant grace if I even have that ability or that authority to do so. But where oftentimes people tell me that I'm off of my empathy brand, what they're talking about is now when you are a leader, or when you are influential, or you have political position or positional power in your family, and now you are doing things that are causing harm to a greater number of people. What do you mean be empathetic to that? Like, you want me to understand the harm you causing to other groups? Like, on an individual level, I absolutely can be empathetic to you. I can understand your position, recognize that what you think, feel, and believe makes total sense to you, even if it doesn't make sense to me. But at the moment in which you start to redirect your energy, and now because of your power, you are harming greater numbers of people, it is the only empathetic thing to do to speak out and speak up. Y'all let me know if y'all disagree on this, but to speak out and up against that, because it is not helpful for our greater community. And then when these groups get together and create policies and practices and laws, whereby now you have built it into the system. No, these things are not okay, and I'm going to speak out against it. And one thing that I think is fascinating is when I consider what happened last weekend with the Montgomery Brawl, I think is what people have coined it. There were folks who were like, we are not our ancestors, and this is not the 1950s and 60s. And I think what we have to be careful about is actually repeating things like that. Because if we just look at the concept of swimming, when people were brought over from Africa to be raped and terrorized and pillaged for all of their intellectual horsepower and physical strength and ability, most of those people could swim. See, and if we only just talking about swimming, but then when you get here, you're like, Black people can't swim in pools. Black people can't swim in the oceans. If they do, we gonna pour acid in it. If they do, we got covenants to say that they, that we can do all kinds of things to them. And now you want to make it like Black people just have something inherently wrong with them, for like they just can't swim. And I use that simple example, but the way the educational system is set up is to make you feel like you're not connected to your ancestors, when actually you are. When there were really strong people who stood up every day in very different ways. Some people overtly, like, taken to the streets willing to be killed for you, but then there were other people who were a little more stealth, maybe even a little more gradual in their approaches. And interestingly enough, we will sometimes mischaracterize who was in which group, because I invite people often to go back. You don't even got to look at something as overt as the letter from the Birmingham jail from Martin Luther King. You look at the first half of the I Have a Dream speech, and I want you to go to work and say the things that he said. Many people don't have the courage to do so, but then they'll say things like, I'm more Malcolm and less Martin. Are you really, though? Are you really? Because 100 years from today, people are going to look back and say about you, I am not my ancestors. Why would they say that? Because what are you doing about disparities in education? What are we doing about disparities in healthcare? There's a lady whose baby just had his head pulled off in childbirth. Now, come on. You know that who that happened to was a Black person, because it's just so ridiculous that anything like that could happen in 2023 in a country that is supposed to be first world, right? Like, I what are people going to say about what you are doing to address banking and lending disparities? Because when I consider myself and what would I do if I were on the Montgomery brawl dock, it's easy to be like, yeah, I was going to jump in and start bopping people. But really? Really? Because if that was just one person fighting one person, then maybe we grant some grace. Maybe people don't need to go to jail. But here's what I understand so far this is what I heard from Lee Merritt, who was representing the brother with the chair. What I heard from Lee Merritt was that allegedly the N-word was flying around, that folks have ties to white supremacist organizations, and then the manager of the crew, when he gives an interview, goes, I don't think this was racial. We've had problems with these people forever. Listen, I don't sit around and make a habit of calling individual people racist or saying that they have racist ideas. That's not a very empathetic way to be. Empathy requires that we grant people grace at an individual level, and that we are curious on an individual level, that we try to understand another person from an individual level. But the moment at which you getting together with other white supremacists so that you can beat up on Black folk in broad daylight and think ain't nothing gonna happen, listen, empathy is not the most appropriate thing. In fact, if you can stand there and watch it, you have what's called psychic numbing, that you have gotten so used to something that you don't even feel like you should stand up and speak out against it. Now, if by law, then we make it okay, like some of these stand your ground laws in some of these states that seem to be able to protect white people when they kill someone, but then everybody else is not protected by these same laws. That's systemic and institutional laws that we should not be empathetic towards. We don't need to understand that that is unfair. We don't need to understand that, look, the way that white evangelicals are talking about Donald Trump today, if you go back 30 years, that's just not how they were. And what was the major change? Perhaps it is you letting little children be raped in your large congregations. Perhaps it is you are stealing money from your congregants knowing that they are poor. Perhaps it is you are cheating. And so if you speak out against Donald Trump, then somehow, former President Donald Trump, then somehow you are indicting yourself. And I understand that on a very basic level. And so what does it look like to show up with empathy, but then also be an absolute social justice warrior? The term we've coined for it is radical empathy. And radical empathy is truly when somebody is just not like you at all, leaning in and fully understanding them. And people think that when I take the time to understand you, that means then I agree with you. But actually, if you understand the pathology of the people, who will every time something is racial go, oh, this is not a race issue. I understand that that's fear. I understand that that's it might be uncomfortable, that might be frustration. And I got it, man. I know what it's like to be fearful and how ridiculous I act when I'm fearful. And somebody needs to stop me from being harmful in those moments. You can't just leave me to just create destruction. Like, who is going to be harmed? If I am a teacher and I have a student with some specialized needs, and I am rigid and I lack understanding and compassion, and I just will not make any accommodations, eventually the only children I'll be able to educate are the ones that are the easiest to educate, the ones who we say got the best parents and the most money, and could probably teach themselves. They don't even need a good teacher. And what good is that? But if I'm a principal of a school and I know that I have a teacher that absolutely lacks empathy, I'll give you a few chances. And there's some people in my circle who suggested I should give you 14 chances. But I can't just let you go on for 14 years harming children. That's just not, that cannot be. That cannot be. And I can't tell you how excited I was on Sunday when my pastor, unbeknownst to me, preached from the book Spark the Heart, because one thing that I had never even considered, but it was so obvious, it's like, if you're a fish, do you recognize water? Is that Jesus is empathetic. And so when you see this large group of people who will say that they are Christian, but they turn their heads when children are being sexually assaulted, when women in the church are being sexually assaulted, sexually harassed. You got all these preachers who got multiple relationships and things like that. Listen, the positional power of that role requires that, look, brother, sister, I love you, and you got to step down. You got to be defrocked. And I can't be out here defending you because in this one spot, I agree with you. And it's what I think was so wonderful is that when I was looking through scripture to try to find scriptures that talk about empathy, they really don't exist, not directly. The Bible teaches most of the time that we should be sympathetic towards people, that we should walk alongside people and be compassionate when they are suffering. And that is not necessarily what empathy is. And I would regularly struggle to try to find things to say, how do you work to understand someone? And what my pastor did was take the relationship between Peter and Jesus and say, okay, through frustration and fear and many other kind of earthly thinking or earthly ideas, that Peter would show up in some ways that just were not acceptable. And Jesus still kept coming back to Peter because Jesus felt like in the relationship that the relationship was solid. But let's just say, what if it was Saul? And let's just say Saul never had his road to Damascus experience, and Saul just out here continually persecuting Christians. I would expect that Jesus was going to say something, that Jesus was going to do something. And so empathy for me is, what are you going to do today? Right? So that 100 years from now, somebody not looking at you talking about, I am not my ancestors. Because our bodies keep the score. Our bodies are vessels that remember what our ancestors have given us, actually. And when you consider the deacons who used to protect King, when you consider the ability to kind of walk out there knowing that people were going to sick dogs on you and spray you down with water, most of us don't have the courage to do none of that. And I'm talking about me too. And so before you say you're not your ancestors, what you gonna be like for the people who are coming after you, the next generation and the next generation and the next generation? What is it that you are doing? Because level of psychic numbing, our ability to just get so used to things. And make this final point, the way we just like, oh, people just need to go and people need to go to jail. Do you know how happy I was when I was watching the Montgomery Brawl, that the police in that situation seemed like they've been through somebody's culturally responsive training? They was like, this is a fight. Ain't nobody shooting. We gonna break it up. We gonna use some pepper spray. Didn't one police officer appear to go above and beyond, like putting their knee on folks' necks and hitting them in the face, which means we have the ability to do that. And I had not seen it demonstrated against Black people until last week. And I was grateful to see it. Grateful to see it. And listen, I watched those videos way more times than I care to admit, but watching through the lens of how am I going to swing my chair? What injustices am I going to stand up for? Because it is just not okay to allow them to keep going. And I think sometimes that hurts the empathy brand, because people think that because you fight, because you do not speak with a soft tone when someone is showing up in ways that are just absolutely unacceptable. Listen, y'all, rape is unacceptable. It is unacceptable. And when you take the time to get your head into the mind of a rapist, you know that there's something you have to do, and that cannot run for president of the United States of America. Choose a conservative candidate, but you let me rape your child and then say that it's okay for me to run for president because, gas prices were whatever, or that, I ran the country well. Let me rape your child and then let me run for president of the United States. See, that's sympathy. That is empathy right there. Let me discriminate against you and the group for which you belong, and let the paper trail go all the way back to the 1970s. And then you let me run for president of the United States. Let me say that the countries that your ancestors are from were S-hole countries, and then let me run for president of the United States. I ask people regularly, write down what are the characteristics of the leaders you appreciate. And I guarantee you that discriminatory rapists who just say the worst things possible is not going to be in your top 10. And empathy cannot sit on a bed of hypocrisy. You get the opportunity to make mistakes, and there are consequences when your mistakes are so egregious. There are some non-negotiables we have to have. And my question to you is, what are you doing right now so that later people are not saying about you, I am not my ancestors? It's Filter Free Friday, y'all. We got plenty of work to do.